Hi, my name is Tanya Zaid-Somil and I'm a project manager here at the Serbian Heritage Museum of Windsor. I'd like to introduce our museum a little bit to you. It has been in existence for about 25 years and it started actually as an idea run by the Serbian Heritage Women's Society. In 1972, they decided that it is time to start collecting the very significant artifacts from the family treasure chests of the Serbs that settled here in Windsor over the years. So why was this important to them? Well, their mandate was to preserve the Serbian heritage, and the Serbian community here in Windsor and the region was so numerous and had a certain history that the collection of such items was not very difficult to start. So over the years, they not only were able to interview the Serbian elders, people who have lived all their lives here in Windsor and contributed to its society, but they also were able to collect very interesting items that were not only part of the family treasures, but a part of the Serbian history from the former Yugoslavia, from their old country. Over the years, enough material was collected that in 1992, that organization of women was able to register museum and that collection as a museum collection and call it Serbian Heritage Museum of Windsor. In 1987, this museum gains this space at the back of me and has been able to be active and very prolific all this entire time. The museum itself has gathered very many interesting individuals that have contributed towards the preservation of the Serbian heritage in many different facets, but we will not get into that. What I would like to tell you is how this community started settling. The recorded arrival of the first Serbian here in Windsor has occurred in 1910, and his name is Mr. Kosta Stevanović. What actually attracted him to Windsor, we don't know, but we do know that he boarded here in 1910 and that he settled, and it was probably not very easy for him to be on his own, probably not knowing enough English language. But luckily for him, very many his compatriots arrived very soon afterwards, so that the community actually became fairly sizable by the early 1920s. By 1925, 1929, the community was sizable enough to be able to feel the friendships and connections growing. Some of the Serbs decided to work in the factories, some of them decided to work in the surrounding area agriculture, and some of them decided to open up stores. Most of them settled in East Windsor, or what was then called the Fort City, and usually purchased houses around Drulard Road. So Drulard Road was their main artery of social life. The very first Serbian house was purchased in the early 1920s, and Serbs congregated there, organized their social events, humanitarian events, where they would share their experiences, learn English language, and perhaps have the first immigration Serbian library. By 1939, the Serbian community becomes quite larger than it was, with very many families following their fathers who settled earlier, and it became ambitious enough to be able to build their own hall. Why I mentioned 1939 is that precise year the first larger Serbian hall was built, and it had all the amenities as today's attractive venue would. They organized very many theatrical productions there, very many social gatherings, dances, and they even were able to create, I would say, an improvisational iconostas where on Sundays they would be able to worship. As the time was passing by, quite a number of Serbs from that community became quite affluent and influential merchants and industrialists who were helping their community financially and in so very many other ways. They didn't have the church all the way up until 1950 52 when they built Gračanica, which is on Meldrum Road and Tecumseh Road. And then later on in the 60s, another church, St. Demetrius, was purchased from the Ukrainian community. So as you see, the Serbian community is getting larger because people are moving in, or because of many children being born. And in 1966, the community decides to build yet another hall, a new one, the one that we are on the grounds right now, in 1966. It used to be much smaller, but very active. And in 1987, the community was able to apply for a government grant that aided them in expanding that smaller hall into what it is today. And as Windsorites know it, it's called Serbian Community Center. Now, one of the stipulations of that grant was that the museum is to be included in its premises, and it has been. So the Serbian community was able to build itself a museum space where it would house already existing collection. Now, how this collection came to life is yet another interesting story. The Serbian Heritage Women's Society was a group of Serbian ladies who believed that it is very important to start collecting items from not only their family treasures, but to give it some kind of a cohesion. So not only that they were able to activate and animate the community to donate very many of their family treasures, but they were able to interview community elders and collect the knowledge of the history of this community. In 1987, as I mentioned that year, the expansion of the community center occurs. Finally, the collection has its space, and by 1992, the collection, as it was at that time, becomes registered as the museum itself, and it is called the Serbian Heritage Museum, a very unique place and unique in the entire Canada. There's no other Serbian museum of culture that exists in Canada except us. So we're hoping that you will find us very interesting. As it is important for the museum to safeguard its collection, it is also very important to collect the knowledge and memories of the community to which it belongs. And Serbian Heritage Museum is doing precisely that. The exhibit that you will be able to see fairly shortly is based on the very important activity that the Serbian community and Windsor can be very proud of. Throughout the history of Serbian community here, the writing and literature and journalism have been very, very important. So the exhibit that you will see here is called Serbian Literature and Journalism in Windsor. Why do I say this? Is precisely because of the very prestigious grant that the Ontario government issued us this year. We were able to start digitizing a portion of our collection, and that portion is focused precisely on the publishing activities of Serbs in Windsor and the region. As a Serbian community, we have very many different cultural and humanitarian societies, and all of them have captured their own histories, and all of them have published anniversary books, articles, different publications that would somehow reflect their activities. But the very important activity that connected the entire community was the publishing of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, a newspaper that existed here for about 40 years. We will talk a little bit more about this as you enter, but what I'd like to do is to invite you to partake in the journey of the written word in Serbian and in English of the Serbs who wrote and published here in Windsor. Wherever Serbs settled in Ontario, they were trying to organize their social life the best that they could and mimic some of the traditions that they brought the knowledge of from home. And one of the bigger communities at the beginning of the 20th century was in Welland, Ontario. And that community, because it was one of the biggest ones, was probably the one that wanted to organize their informative life as well. Driven by nostalgia for their language, tradition, culture, and news from the homeland, Serbs tried to organize the newspapers. In 1916, the first chapter of the Serbian National Shield Society of Canada was organized or founded in Welland, Ontario, and as one of the results of their activities, they organized the very first newspaper in Serbian language that was run without interruption between 1916 to 1918 in Welland, Ontario, and Mr. Mićun Pavićević was its founder and editor. Later on, as time was passing by, the new waves of immigrants arrived, and by December 1934, Mr. Božidar Marković established Glas Kanade, or Voice of Canada, in Toronto. This newspaper was the second newspaper in Serbian language for the Serbs of Ontario, and was based in Toronto, and ran without interruption from December 27, 1934 to January 6, 1944. And in 1944, the newspaper was purchased by the Serbian National Shield Society of Canada because they needed to have their own formal method of information. In the documents that you just saw before you, you were able to see that the Serbian National Shield Society of Canada purchased the Voice of Canada newspaper in 1944 for about 3,000 Canadian dollars, and that they changed the name of Voice of Canada to Voice of Canadian Serbs, hoping to reach the wider readership. It became the official publication of the society, and it was moved to Windsor to be published weekly on Thursdays in a small building that you see right now in front of you at the address of 1297 Drouillard Road. The society president, Petar Bulat, an influential merchant from Windsor, was instrumental in moving the newspaper to his city and arranging all needed equipment, office space, legal issues, etc. With the other two of his colleagues, Mr. Paja Popov and Mr. Petar Ćuk, he started with a small printing press previously owned and operated by Mr. Savo Kovač for a number of years. With that small printing press, he added three larger linotype machines that were purchased from the Canadian Army and shipped to Windsor from Simcoe Military Base sometime in 1945. Between 1945 and 1954, the newspaper was compiled and edited by the editorial board, the group of gentlemen that you see here before you, where Mr. Petar Bulat, Mr. Dr. Jovan Jovetic, Mr. Fedor Rajic, and a few others were the editors, and they were also contributors. They wrote articles, there were typesetters, there were printers, photographers, and anything else that the newspaper needed them to do. They also enlisted volunteer help from the community to fold and mail many newspapers to the Serbian readership all over the world. So the community was busy with maintaining this newspaper. Some of the issues of The Voice reached the refugees in many civilian camps across Europe, where they awaited their uncertain fate and were able to read about a large Serbian community in Windsor where life must have been better. Some of the Serbian elders who came here and settled in Windsor later on were telling us how when they were in Italy or in Austria, in the civilian refugee camps where they were awaited their uncertain future, when they came across the issue of Voice of Canadian Serbs, they felt somehow comforted that there is some kind of a solution for their situation, and they were hoping to come to Canada. Now, some of the issues reached the exiled Serbian royal family and the government officials who were in England, scattered intellectuals, university professors, capitalists, and ordinary civilians who all craved to know what is the latest news on political situation in Yugoslavia, or what is the social issue that majority is dealing with in many countries wherever Serbians have settled. Windsor was the center of the Serbian community in Canada for many years. Aside from its size, aside from the church activities, much of those have focused on the Shield Society and the Voice of Canadian Serbs, which was an important forum for Serbian writers in Canada, many of whom wrote critical articles about the communist takeover of Yugoslavia. Some others wrote poetry, others again recorded the history and activities of Canadian Serbs all over Canada, specifically in Ontario. In addition, noted Serbian writers from Yugoslavia submitted their literary pieces to the Voice of Canadian Serbs. And so, over the years, the hundreds of writers from various countries contributed to this newspaper. After the Politika and the American Srbobran, other two newspapers in Serbian language, the Voice of Canadian Serbs is the third oldest continuously published Serbian newspaper in the world. And out of the 68 years of its existence, almost 40 of them, the newspaper spent or was published in Windsor. So as you see, the Serbian National Shield Society made a very good decision of absorbing the Voice of Canada a long time ago and renaming it into Voice of Canadian Serbs, and therefore giving the Serbs throughout the world not only a great read, but a great forum to be able to express their thoughts, political, social, literary, cultural, or otherwise. By 1954, it was clear that the articles in this weekly newspaper were not sufficient expression enough for the Serbian community. At its 1954 annual Congress in Montreal, the Serbian National Shield Society established that the first Serbian publishing house in Canada, named Avala, and its shareholders were all the members of the Shield Society. This publishing house was affectionately called the first Serbian printing house in the free world. Avala published a large number of books by many noted Serbian authors such as Bishop Nikolaj Velimirović, Mr. Adam Pribicević, who was the diplomat and a politician for most of his life and resided in Windsor, Mr. Radoje Knežević, who was the tutor to King Peter II Karađorđević and moved from England to Windsor to become one of the editors of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, Mr. Slobodan Jovanović, who was a professor of law and Serbian historian for his entire life, Mr. Bora Karapanđić, Miss Olga Marković, and many, many more, among whom can be counted a few writers of other ethnic backgrounds, for example, Mr. Fran Erjavec, a Slovenian, who also wrote about Serbs in Windsor and published through Avala Printing and Publishing House. Thus, Windsor has the distinct honor of being the focal point for Serbian writers from many countries, mainly the USA, England, Yugoslavia, South Africa, France, and wherever else Serbs have settled. We're entering in the decade of 1950s, where the writing and publishing of the Serbian word was probably the most active. And during that time, in the early 50s, the print press of the Voice of Canadian Serbs was the one that issued and published many of these books that you see before you. And later on, after 1954, Avala Printing and Publishing took over the publishing activities. So in the 1950s, you were able to see a number of books that we have in our collection, and some of the titles are The Trilateral Agreement and Prince Paul Karađorđević, written by Mr. Radoje Knežević, the man that I mentioned earlier that was at the time the editor of Voice of Canadian Serbs. Then we have the Book of Draža 1 and 2, also written by him, and the book is actually about the General Draža Mihailović, who was instrumental leader of the resistance movement from 1941 to 1943 against the German invasion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Then we have From Gentleman to Peasant, a book written by Mr. Adam Pribicevic. As I mentioned him earlier, he was a diplomat and a politician in his life before migration to Windsor. Then we have historical books of Princesses of the House of Nemanjić by Mr. Miodrag Purković, who was exploring mostly the medieval Serbian history and wrote and published through Avala Printing and Publishing. And then we have In the Service to Homeland, the book written by Mr. Bora Kačarević. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the writers came from other nationalities, and this one is Mr. Fran Erjevec with the title Slovenes and Serbs. We also have the book visible here by our famous and beloved Vladika Velimirović, The Neverland. And we could easily say that 1950s and 60s later on were the golden age of the publishing activity in Windsor. Windsor was important and interesting to the royal family, where if you look up above, you will see the photograph of our King Peter II Karađorđević seated in the office of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, speaking with Mr. Petar Bulat, the president of the Serbian National Shield Society and the administrator and editor of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, chatting. And when we were looking through the archival photographs, looking for the interior look of these offices, we were able to find this photograph, and as they're seated, we discovered that we have the authentic piece behind His Majesty King Peter II, which is a typewriting machine that you are able to see on the table, on the writing desk here before you. When we were organizing this exhibit, we simply tried to mimic the look of the news press room office from the 50s and 60s. So our King Peter II came to visit us in 1959 on the tour through North America that he tried to do on an annual basis, and he found Windsor very interesting, as well as the Voice of Canadian Serbs and Avala Printing and Publishing, so he came to visit us and explore how everything worked. A second royal visit happened in 1965, where his brother, Prince Tomislav Karađorđević, came to visit Windsor with his wife, Princess Margaret. As you see, Princess Margaret is curiously entering into the building on Drulard Road, the central office of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, and what she would have seen upon entry would be something like this. As I said before, we tried to mimic the office of the Voice of Canadian Serbs from the 50s and 60s. She would also seen the printing press that you see here up above on the photograph. You see 3 linotype machines. You are seeing the original Heidelberg machine that was quite powerful one and was able to do so many different types of printing activities, and you would have also seen her with her husband, Prince Tomislav, in the middle, overlooking the old Heidelberg machine. You would also you can also see Mr. Fedor Rajic, at that time one of the editors of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, showing them the process. In the bottom of the photograph, the gentleman who's holding a paper is Mr. Petar Bulat, and to your left, one of the gentlemen onlooking the entire scene is Mr. Milorad Gaćeša, one of the administrators of the Voice of Canadian Serbs, and later on the administrator of Avala Printing and Publishing for a number of years, all the way up until 1984. As you see, Avala Printing and Publishing was very active and busy place. As you look down from the photograph onto the table, onto the writing desk, you will be able to see an old typewriting machine that was actually purchased in Chicago in the 40s, and very many of these editors and contributors wrote and typed their thoughts on it. We have Mr. Fedor Rajic, we have Mr. Velimir Tošković, we have Mr. Milorad Gaćeša, and a few others that were very important contributors to the newspaper. The Avala Printing and Publishing continued all the way up until 1983 to function and to publish many books. Through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 80s, it published a great deal of books that were very important titles that varied in topics, but were mostly favoring the political studies and social studies of the Serbs from homeland and from diaspora. You can see in front of you as well 2 cabinets where some of the artifacts we were able to preserve from the Avala offices. One is the metal typecast in Cyrillic, Serbian Cyrillic, that were dating from 1948, that were donated by Gaćeša family to this museum. And you're also able to see in the background in that small cabinet the Voice of Canadian Serbs logo and the logos of Serbian National Shield Society that were used to print on paper. To your left, there is an old calculating machine that was used in the offices to perhaps calculate how many issues are going to be sold that particular week, how many was, what was the profit, etc. But to return to the books, to your left on the wall, it is important to notice that many of these books, we have few, but many of these books have had a great readership. The authors writing in the 70s and the 80s have the feeling of achievement in the writing activity, and they wanted to reflect fairly often on their work, so there's a lot of anniversary books that commemorate the Voice of Canadian Serbs. The cabinet to the very corner, to your right, we see the image of Mr. Branko Memedović in his young days, specifically 1948, when he was the young officer in the Royal Army of Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And why we wish to focus on him in particular is because he was the longest standing contributor to the Voice of Canadian Serbs, the entire 50 years of his contributing life, and he also had the column in the Voice of Canadian Serbs that is even running to this day. It's called A Little Bit for Everybody, where authors after his passing were able to write about anything that is interesting or curious about the Serbian life across the planet in his honor. In addition to Avala, Windsor had 2 independent publishers whose production was much smaller. Their names were Mišić Printing Company, owned by Mr. Miloš Mišić, and operated from 1975 to 1994. And later on, Peron Printing, another a Serbian-owned printing company owned by Mr. Pero Kovačević and operated from 1994 for several years. They too contributed to the preservation of the portion of the local history. As printing companies, they allowed good number of self-published authors to emerge. For example, Mr. Branko Memedović, when he decided to write poetry, Mr. Uroš Zonjić, Mr. Radislav Grujičić, also the poet, Mr. Žarko Vučinić, Mr. Sreten Jovanović, and Mr. Đorđe Gavrić. There has been others as well, but these were the most active. Some experienced authors, like Mr. Branko Memedović, only continued publishing his work at Mišić Printing Company and Peron Printing after Avala Printing and Publishing was closed in 1983. Mišić Printing was located in the heart of Walkerville at the address of 640 Chilver Road and was a busy print press for a variety of Serbian cultural organizations that printed their anniversary books, pamphlets, and event posters there. He was so popular that he really didn't need to invest into advertising, as some people say, because the word of mouth was the best advertising for his small printing operation. Peron Press, owned by Mr. Petar Kovačević, who was a man who learned printing skills in Avala and at Mišić, was the last Serbian-owned and operated printing press that encouraged authors from within the community to publish there. The print shop has since closed, but the Serbian authors continue to publish throughout a variety of other local publishers and printing houses. For example, we have today Mr. Branko Malešević, who not only wrote in the 80s, but his latest books, Serbs in Windsor, just came out fresh off the press in 2013. Cultural societies of the Serbian community were also producing their own anniversary publications, pamphlets, and yearbooks through which they were recording their own histories. And some early ones, such as Yugoslavian Soko Association, do not exist any longer, but many of them are still active, such as Serbian Singing Society of Gračanica, Circle of Serbian Sisters, Princess Helen, also of Gračanica, Serbian Business and Professional Association, Serbian Crown Lodge 345, etc. In later decades, towards our own time, perhaps the publishing activities have lessened, but they're still there, and we're still proud of the people who are contributing. And the authors who wrote many anniversary books in the 90s and between 2000 and 2013 are still active. We hope that you enjoyed the tour of our exhibit and felt a bit of the newsroom atmosphere from the 50s and 60s that we tried to recreate here. We hope you learned a little bit about us and were able to keep some of this written heritage that the museum is safeguarding and trying to preserve. Come and visit us to learn or research some more. We're open.